Karen's fake HOA cops brandish real guns in a legal nightmare. All right, folks, buckle up and welcome back to HOA Karen Files, where we dig into the craziest, most jaw-dropping stories of HOA tyrants and suburban showdowns that'll leave you speechless. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our crew. We're about to unravel a tale so wild, so intense, it'll make your blood boil and your head spin. This ain't your typical Karen meltdown. This is a story of a power-hungry Karen, fake HOA cops waving real guns, and a neighborhood dragged into a legal firestorm. Picture a quiet suburb turned upside down by one woman's obsession and a standoff that could have ended in tragedy. Stick around, because this one's got twists that hit like a freight train. Smash that like button if you're ready for some serious drama, and drop a comment. Ever run into a Karen who went this far? Let's get into it. This story comes straight out of Maple Ridge, a postcard-perfect suburb where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. But beneath the manicured lawns and shiny SUVs, a storm was brewing, one that would land people in court, ruin reputations, and nearly cost lives. It all started with Karen, a woman who thought she owned the neighborhood, and ended with a retired sheriff named Earl staring down the barrel of a gun. This is a tale of control, deception, and the law stepping in when things went too far. Maple Ridge was the kind of place where folks waved at neighbors, kids played in cul-de-sacs, and the biggest drama was whose pie won at the annual bake-off. That is, until Karen moved in. Karen, a 52-year-old former insurance agent with a blonde bob that screamed, "I mean business," didn't just join the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, she hijacked it. Within months of buying her sprawling McMansion, complete with a 3-car garage and a fountain shaped like a dolphin, she'd strong-armed her way to HOA president. Nobody voted against her. They were too scared. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She lived for them. The HOA Handbook, a 250-page tome of regulations, was her Bible. She carried it everywhere, dog-eared and highlighted, ready to cite obscure codes at a moment's notice. Forgot to mow your lawn by Saturday? She'd slap a $300 fine on your door. Parked your RV in the driveway for an hour? That's a $500 penalty, plus a letter threatening foreclosure. Karen's golf cart, nicknamed the Enforcer, was a daily sight, cruising the streets with her clipboard and a glare that could curdle milk. She'd stop to measure mailbox heights, inspect flower beds for unapproved colors, and even demand that kids' lemonade stands get permits. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, swore Karen had binoculars to spy on backyards, but nobody could prove it. The neighborhood groaned under her iron fist. The HOA board, meek retirees like Carl and Doris, nodded along to her demands. Too spineless to push back, Karen's fines piled up, draining bank accounts and sparking whispered rebellions over backyard barbecues. "Someone's got to stop her," folks muttered, but nobody dared. Nobody, that is, except Earl. Earl was a 66-year-old retired sheriff, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard and a no-nonsense stare honed over 35 years on the force he'd moved to Maple Ridge for peace. Settling into a modest ranch house with a front yard flagpole and a vegetable patch where he grew peppers and squash. Earl kept his lawn tidy, his flag crisp, but he wasn't about to bow to Karen's nonsense. When she cited him for non-compliant vegetable visibility, Code 17B, he tossed the notice in the trash. When she fined him $200 or $100 for flagpole shadow interference, he laughed it off. "I've faced bank robbers, Karen," he told her once. "Your clipboard don't scare me." But Karen wasn't used to defiance. One scorching July afternoon, she spotted Earl's latest offense, a hand-painted birdhouse shaped like a tiny barn, hanging from his oak tree. The kids loved it, tossing seeds into its feeder, while Earl swapped stories about his sheriff days. To Karen, it was a structural violation and a personal insult. She screeched to a halt in her golf cart, megaphone in hand, her voice echoing across Maple Ridge. "Earl, this illegal bird feeder violates Code 29F, she bellowed, waving a fine. "It's an eyesore, and it's attracting vermin. Remove it by sundown or I'll have it torn down myself." Earl, watering his peppers, didn't even look up. It's a birdhouse, Karen, not a meth lab. Kids like it. Go find a real problem. Karen's face turned purple, clashing with her lime green visor. This is my neighborhood, Earl, and I won't let your hillbilly junk ruin our property values. You've got till tomorrow, or you'll regret it. She sped off, tires squealing, already plotting her next move. Earl shook his head, but he knew Karen meant business. She'd once had a neighbor's fence demolished over a color violation. He called his old deputy buddy Tom, now a lawyer. Tom, this Karen's a loose cannon. Any legal angle to shut her down? Tom sighed. HOAs are a gray area, Earl, but if she's breaking laws, we can nail her. Keep records of everything. Earl nodded, tucking his fines into a folder. He didn't know it, but Karen was about to cross a line that would land her in a courtroom. Karen, fuming in her McMansion, wasn't waiting for the HOA board. They were too slow, too weak. She needed muscle, someone to make Earl comply. Late that night, hunched over her laptop, she found Maple Ridge Enforcement Solutions, a shady website promising elite HOA compliance with armed support. The cost was $600, but Karen didn't blink. She wired the money, her hands shaking with righteous fury. Earl's birdhouse was the first domino, and she was ready to knock it down. Karen's fines were one thing, but her obsession with Earl's birdhouse lit a spark in Maple Ridge. Earl wasn't about to tear it down. He'd built it with his grandson, and the kids' smiles were worth more than any HOA rulebook. Instead, he turned it into a rallying cry. He invited the neighborhood kids to decorate it, handing out paintbrushes and letting them splash it with reds, blues, and yellows. Little Tommy, a freckled 10-year-old, painted a sheriff's star on the side, giggling, "It's Sheriff Earl's fort." Mrs. Thompson, a 75-year-old widow with a knack for knitting, hung a tiny scarf on it. Even quiet Mr. Garcia, a mechanic who avoided HOA meetings, stopped by to screw on a sturdier perch. "Karen's gone too far," he muttered. "This is our home." The birdhouse became Maple Ridge's line in the sand. Neighbors fed up with years of Karen's tyranny started whispering about fighting back. At a backyard poker game, Bob, a burly plumber, slammed his beer down. "Earl's right, we can't let her run us out of town." Sally, a schoolteacher, suggested a petition to oust Karen, but others shook their heads. "She'll just fine us into bankruptcy," they said. Still, the mood was shifting. Maple Ridge was waking up Karen, meanwhile was losing it. From her McMansion's balcony, she watched kids flock to Earl's yard, their laughter like nails on a chalkboard. She fired off a dozen violation notices, $100 for unauthorized paint, $250 for public gathering without permit. But Earl ignored them, stacking them in his garage. Her HOA board, usually spineless, started dodging her calls. "It's just a birdhouse, Karen," Doris mumbled at a meeting. Karen slammed her rulebook down. "It's rebellion. If we let Earl win, this neighborhood's finished." Desperate, Karen checked her email for Maple Ridge Enforcement Solutions. A reply confirmed, "Team dispatched tomorrow, armed and ready for compliance." Karen's lips curled into a smirk. She didn't care who they were. She wanted Earl's birdhouse gone, and she wanted him humbled. Earl, sensing trouble, tightened his defenses. He'd seen Karen's golf cart circling his house at odd hours. Her megaphone silent, but her glare deadly. He called Tom again. "She's up to something, Tom." "Feels like more than fines," Tom, digging through HOA records, found discrepancies. Missing funds, unauthorized expenses. "Karen's been skimming HOA dues, Earl. If she's hiring muscle, that's illegal. Keep your eyes peeled." Earl checked his old .38 special, still locked in its safe. He hadn't touched it since retiring, but his sheriff instincts were screaming. The next morning, Maple Ridge felt heavy, like a storm was coming. Kids stayed inside, and Mrs. Thompson canceled her knitting circle. Karen, in her golf cart, wore a triumphant grin, her rulebook tucked under her arm. She thought she was about to win. She had no idea what she'd unleashed. A rusty pickup truck growled into Maple Ridge. Its HOA enforcement decal, sloppily painted on the side out, stepped two men who looked like they'd wandered off a bad action movie set. Hank, a 45-year-old ex-con with a buzz cut and a fake badge clipped to his belt, carried a real Smith & Wesson 45, tucked loosely in his waistband. Jimmy, a twitchy 32-year-old with a rap sheet for fraud, clutched a forged HOA citation, his cheap sunglasses fogging up with sweat. Their uniforms, black t-shirts with Maple Ridge security and peeling letters, screamed amateur, but the gun was no joke. Karen met them on her driveway, hands on hips like a general inspecting mercenaries. "You're late," she snapped, pointing at Earl's house. "That man's birdhouse is a blight, and he's inciting anarchy. I want it destroyed, and I want him scared stiff." Hank cracked his neck, smirking. "No sweat, lady. We'll make him cry, uncle." Jimmy, less sure, whispered, "Hank, you said this was a quick gig. That gun's hot, man." "Stolen!" Hank glared. "Shut up and look tough." Earl was fixing a loose nail on his birdhouse when the pickup rolled up. The street went quiet. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Kids hid in garages. Hank strutted over, 45 glinting, while Jimmy waved the citation like a white flag. "Yo, old man," Hank barked. "This birdhouse violates Code 29F. Tear it down, or we're taking it apart ourselves." Earl set down his hammer, eyes narrowing. He'd faced armed punks before, and these two were all bravado. No brains. "You ain't cops," he said, voice steady. "That badge is dollar store trash, and your paper's worth less than my grocery list. Get off my lawn." Karen, hovering behind, screeched, "They're enforcers, Earl. You're finished." Hank, itching to prove himself, pulled the 45 and aimed it at the birdhouse. "Last chance, Grandpa, move, or this gets messy." The air turned thick, Mrs. Pinarton's. Thompson gasped from her porch, clutching her knitting needles. Mr. Garcia froze, his wrench still in hand. Bob, watching from his garage, dialed 911, whispering, "Guys with guns at Earl's." Earl locked eyes with Hank, reading him like a book, nervous, trigger-happy, dangerous. "You pull that trigger, son. You're looking at hard time," Earl said. "Walk away." Hank laughed, but his hands shook. Jimmy, panicking, dropped his citation. "Hank, let's bail. This is bad." Karen, unhinged, shoved Jimmy. "Do your job. I paid for results." The standoff was a powder keg, and Maple Ridge was one spark from disaster. The sun hung low over Maple Ridge, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns and silent cul-de-sacs. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of tension that precedes a thunderstorm or a disaster. Earl stood by his hand-painted birdhouse, hammer still in hand, his grizzled face set like stone. Across from him, Hank, the burly fake HOA cop, gripped his stolen Smith & Wesson 45, its barrel pointed at the tiny barn-shaped feeder that had become the neighborhood's symbol of defiance. Jimmy, Hank's twitchy sidekick, was halfway to their rusty pickup, his forged citations scattered on the grass like confetti from a failed parade. Karen, her blonde bob quivering with rage, stood behind Hank, shrieking orders like a drill sergeant gone rogue. "Destroy it!" she screamed, her lime green visor nearly flying off. "That birdhouse is a slap in my face." Maple Ridge was a powder keg, and Hank's trembling finger on the trigger was the match. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, their hearts pounding. Mrs. Thompson, the 70-year-old widow, clutched her knitting needles on her porch. Whispering prayers, Mr. Garcia, the mechanic, gripped his wrench, frozen in his driveway. Bob, the plumber who'd called 911, crouched in his garage, relaying the scene to the dispatcher. "They've got a gun on Earl. Hurry!" Sacrum. The kids, usually scampering around Earl's yard, were huddled in garages, their painted Sheriff Earl star on the birdhouse glinting in the fading light. Earl's eyes locked onto Hank's, reading him like a suspect in an interrogation room. 35 years as a sheriff had taught him to spot the difference between a tough guy and a coward. Hank was the latter. Big talk, shaky hands, the kind of man who'd crumble under pressure. "You don't want this, son," Earl said, his voice low, steady, cutting through Karen's hysterics. "That gun's stolen, ain't it? You fire it, you're not just looking at jail. You're looking at a world of hurt. Put it down, and we all walk away." Hank's smirk faltered. but he tightened his grip. "Shut it, old man. This ain't your beat anymore. Step back, or I'll blast that birdhouse to splinters." His voice cracked, betraying the fear behind his bravado. Jimmy, now at the pickup's door, yelled, "Hank, let's go, this is nuts!" But Karen wasn't having it. She stormed forward, shoving Jimmy aside, her face a mask of fury. "Do your job," she screeched, jabbing a manicured nail at Hank. "I paid you to end this. Crush him." The neighborhood held its breath. Earl didn't flinch, but his mind raced. He'd faced armed standoffs before, bank heists, domestic calls gone wrong. But this was his front yard, his home, his neighbors watching his. 38 Special was locked in the safe inside, useless now. All he had was his hammer and his nerve, and he wasn't about to back down. "Karen," he said, turning his gaze to her, "you hired these clowns to scare me? You're in deeper than you think. This ain't just about a birdhouse anymore. You're playing with felonies." Karen's eyes widened, but she doubled down, her voice shrill. "Felonies? You're the criminal, Earl, defying my rules, turning my neighborhood into a circus. These men are my enforcers, and they'll make you comply." She grabbed a citation from the grass and flung it at Earl, the paper fluttering uselessly to the ground. Hank, egged on, stepped closer, the 45 now inches from the birdhouse. "Last chance, Grandpa," he growled. "Move, or I shoot." That's when Mrs. Thompson snapped the old widow, who'd spent decades knitting scarves and baking pies, marched off her porch, knitting needles raised like tiny swords. "You leave Earl alone, you no-good thugs," she shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. Mr. Garcia, inspired, stepped forward, wrench in hand. "Back off, or you'll deal with all of us." He called. Bob emerged from his garage, fists clenched, and Sally, the school teacher, joined from her driveway, brandishing a broom. "This is our neighborhood," she yelled. The Maple Ridge Rebellion, sparked by a birdhouse, was now a united front. Hank's bravado cracked. He glanced at the growing crowd, his gun hands shaking harder. Jimmy, panicking, climbed into the pickup and revved the engine. "Hank, now!" he screamed. Karen, oblivious to the tide turning, kept screaming, "Shoot it! Shoot it!" But Earl saw his chance. He stepped forward, hammer raised, not to swing, but to draw Hank's focus. "You're outnumbered, son," he said, voice calm but commanding. "Cops are on their way. You fire that gun, you're done. Drop it." Utonartana, Hank's eyes darted from Earl to the neighbors, then to Karen, who was still ranting. The wail of sirens broke the silence, distant but closing fast. Hank's nerve broke. He lowered the 45, cursing under his breath, and bolted for the pickup. But in his panic, he tripped over a garden hose, the gun slipping from his hand and skidding across the grass. Earl lunged, kicking the weapon under his birdhouse, out of reach. Hank scrambled to his feet, diving into the pickup as Jimmy floored it, the truck screeching out of Maple Ridge, leaving a trail of dust and Karen's shattered plans. Karen stood frozen, her mouth agape, as the neighbors erupted in cheers. Mrs. Thompson hugged Sally, Bob pumped his fist, and Mr. Garcia clapped Earl on the back. But Earl's face was grim. He picked up the 45 with a rag, careful not to smudge prints, and set it on his porch. The sirens were louder now, red and blue lights flashing at the end of the street. Karen, realizing her enforcers had fled, turned on Earl, her voice a desperate wail. "This isn't over, Earl. I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone. You'll pay for this." Earl shook his head, his sheriff's stare cutting through her. "Karen, you hired armed thugs to threaten a neighbor over a birdhouse. You're not suing anybody. You're going to court." As the first police cruiser pulled up, Earl waved them over. The stolen gun in plain sight, Karen's reign of terror was crumbling. But the real fight was just beginning. The cops, led by Officer Daniels, a young but sharp deputy who knew Earl from his sheriff days, took statements. "Earl, you all right?" Daniels asked, eyeing the 45. Earl nodded. "Just protecting my property. These jokers were Karen's hired muscle. Check that gun. It's hot." Daniels bagged the weapon, then turned to Karen, who was trying to slip away in her golf cart. "Ma'am, you're not going anywhere," he said, blocking her path. Karen sputtered. I'm the victim. Earl's the one breaking rules. But the neighbors, now a chorus, shouted her down. She hired them. They had a gun. She's been robbing us blind. As Daniels cuffed Karen for questioning, Earl called Tom, his lawyer friend. Tom, it's hit the fan. Karen hired goons with a stolen gun. Got anything on her yet? Tom's voice was grim. Oh yeah, she's been siphoning HOA funds for months. Thousands gone. This stunt just sealed her fate. Keep that gun safe. It's evidence. Earl hung up, watching Karen argue with Daniels. Her megaphone, abandoned on the grass Maple Ridge, had won this battle. But the war wasn't over. Karen wasn't going down without a fight, and Earl knew the law would have to finish what his birdhouse started. The morning after the standoff, Maple Ridge was a ghost town. Front doors stayed locked. Kids didn't play, and the usual hum of lawnmowers was silent. The neighborhood was reeling, still processing the sight of a gun in Hank's hand, Karen's meltdown, and the police hauling her away in cuffs. Earl's birdhouse, now a battle-scarred symbol, stood proud, its sheriff's star painted by little Tommy gleaming in the sunlight. But Earl wasn't celebrating. He sat on his porch, sipping black coffee, his old sheriff's badge on the table beside him. He'd stopped a disaster, but Karen's shadow still loomed, and the law was about to take center stage. Officer Daniels and his team had worked through the night. The stolen .45, traced to a pawn shop robbery, was a slam dunk. Hank and Jimmy were looking at felony charges for possession of a stolen firearm, brandishing, and attempted assault. The pickup, abandoned in a ditch outside town, led cops to a motel where the duo was hiding. Hank, still cocky, tried to pin it all on Karen, claiming she'd demanded maximum force. Jimmy, cracking under pressure, spilled everything. Maple Ridge Enforcement Solutions was a scam, a front run by a lowlife named Vinny, who targeted HOAs with promises of compliance. They'd hit dozens of neighborhoods, shaking down residents for cash. But Karen's $600 job was their sloppiest yet. She was crazy, Jimmy whined. Wanted us to scare an old man over a birdhouse. Karen, meanwhile, was in hot water. At the station, she played the victim, her voice dripping with fake tears. I'm just a concerned citizen, she cried, clutching her rulebook. Earl's birdhouse was ruining Maple Ridge. I hired professionals to enforce our laws. But Daniels wasn't buying it. Tom, Earl's lawyer friend, had sent over a bombshell. Bank records showing Karen had siphoned $15,000 from HOA dues over 2 years. She'd funneled it into personal expenses, her dolphin fountain, a new golf cart, and now armed enforcers, embezzlement, fraud, and hiring armed criminals to intimidate a resident. Karen was facing a legal tsunami. Earl called to the station to give his statement, laid it out plain. Karen's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, he told Daniels. Fines, threats, making folks miserable. That birdhouse was just an excuse. She wanted control when I wouldn't bend. She hired those goons. He handed over his stack of violation notices, each one a piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Garcia, Bob, and Sally gave statements too, painting a picture of Karen's reign. Fines that bankrupted families, threats that silenced dissent, and an HOA board too scared to act. She's a bully, Mrs. Thompson said, her knitting needles clicking furiously. And now she's a criminal. The HOA board, finally growing a spine, called an emergency meeting at the community center. The room was packed. Every resident showed up, from retirees to young parents, their anger palpable. Doris, the board's treasurer, admitted Karen had bullied them into silence. She said we'd lose our homes if we didn't obey, she whispered, tears in her eyes. Carl, the secretary, revealed Karen's secret ledger, hidden in her McMansion, detailing every cent she'd stolen. The crowd roared, demanding her ouster by unanimous vote. Karen was stripped of her presidency, and the board resigned, paving the way for a new election. But Karen wasn't done fighting. Released on bail, she stormed back to Maple Ridge, her golf cart blazing, and posted a handwritten notice of intent on every mailbox, claiming she was unlawfully persecuted and would sue the neighborhood for defamation. It was a desperate move, and it backfired spectacularly. Tom, armed with the ledger and bank records, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of Maple Ridge residents, seeking restitution for Karen's fines and stolen funds. The district attorney, smelling a high-profile case, charged Karen with embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit assault, and endangering public safety. Hank and Jimmy, facing their own charges, agreed to testify against her for lighter sentences. The trial was a spectacle. Maple Ridge residents filled the courtroom, their faces a mix of relief and fury. Karen, dressed in a tailored blazer, tried to charm the jury, but her lies unraveled. Tom presented the ledger, bank records, and Earl's violation notices. Proving her financial crimes, Earl took the stand, his sheriff's badge pinned to his jacket, and recounted the standoff, his voice steady but heavy. "She hired men with a stolen gun to threaten me over a birdhouse," he said. "That's not an HOA president, that's a menace." Mrs. Thompson, trembling but resolute, described years of harassment, her testimony bringing jurors to tears. Hank, in an orange jumpsuit, confirmed Karen's orders. She said, "Make him regret it. We thought it was easy money." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Karen, pale and shaking, was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with restitution orders for every dime she'd stolen. Hank got 3 years for firearms charges. Jimmy 1 for fraud. Vinny, the scam's mastermind, was arrested in a sting. His enforcement solutions shut down Maple Ridge. Battered but unbroken, had won back home. The neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board, led by Sally, slashed the rulebook to 10 pages, banning fines and focusing on community. Earl's birdhouse became a monument, with kids adding new paint. Each spring, Mrs. Thompson knitted a tiny flag for it, and Mr. Garcia built a bench nearby where neighbors swapped stories over coffee. Bob organized a block party, the first in years, with laughter echoing past Karen's empty McMansion. Now in foreclosure, Earl, ever the quiet hero, downplayed his role. "Just did what was right," he'd say, tending his peppers. But Maple Ridge knew better. They'd faced a tyrant, stared down a gun, and reclaimed their home, all because one sheriff refused to back down. Karen's legal nightmare was over, but her legacy, a lesson in the cost of power, would linger in Maple Ridge forever. Epilogue. Maple Ridge rises from the ashes. 2 years had passed since the standoff that turned Maple Ridge upside down, but the echoes of that sweltering July day still lingered in the quiet suburb. The once oppressive air of Karen's reign had lifted, replaced by the hum of lawnmowers, the laughter of kids, and the clink of coffee mugs at impromptu porch gatherings. Maple Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community, forged in the fire of a birdhouse rebellion and tempered by the hammer of justice. The scars of Karen's tyranny remained, but they were fading, covered by new growth, new hope, and a hard-won lesson about the cost of unchecked power. Earl's ranch house stood as it always had, modest but proud, its vegetable patch now sprawling with peppers, squash, and a new row of tomatoes planted by the neighborhood kids. The birdhouse, that hand-painted symbol of defiance, was still there, perched on its oak branch. Its sheriff's star faded, but unbroken little Tommy, now 12 and a foot taller, stopped by every Saturday to toss seeds into its feeder, swapping stories with Earl about baseball and the old sheriff's tales from the force. "You're a legend, Sheriff Earl," Tommy would say, grinning. Earl would just chuckle, ruffling the kid's hair. "Ain't no legend, kid, just a guy who likes his birds." The birdhouse had become more than a feeder. It was Maple Ridge's monument. Neighbors added their own touches over time. A tiny weather vane from Mr. Garcia, a knitted flag from Mrs. Thompson, a carved wooden perch from Bob. Sally, the school teacher who'd brandished a broom during the standoff, organized a birdhouse day each spring, where kids painted new designs and parents shared potluck dishes under Earl's oak tree. The event wasn't just a celebration, it was a reminder of what they'd fought for and what they'd never let happen again. Karen's McMansion, once the gleaming fortress of her empire, stood empty, its dolphin fountain dry and cracked. A foreclosure sign had replaced her pristine mailbox, and weeds crept through the once manicured lawn. After her conviction, Karen had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, 3 for embezzlement, 2 for conspiracy to commit assault, with additional fines to repay the $15,000 she'd stolen from HOA dues. The judge had been merciless, citing her flagrant abuse of power and reckless endangerment of Maple Ridge. Karen's appeals failed, her lawyers unable to counter the mountain of evidence. Tom's ledger, Earl's violation notices, and Hank's testimony that she demanded maximum force against a retired sheriff over a birdhouse word around Maple Ridge was that Karen was struggling in prison. A former cellmate, interviewed by a local paper, said she tried to start an inmate activities committee and was promptly shut down by the warden. "She's still bossy," the cellmate laughed, "but nobody's scared of her anymore." Rumor had it Karen was paroled early for good behavior, only to resurface in a Florida trailer park, where she was reportedly feuding with a campground manager over unauthorized picnic tables. Maple Ridge didn't care Karen was gone. Her name, a cautionary tale whispered at block parties. Don't pull a Karen, Hank and Jimmy, the fake HOA cops, faced their own reckoning. Hank, the gun-wielding ex-con, got 3 years for possession of a stolen firearm and brandishing, plus a year for conspiracy. Jimmy, the nervous sidekick, took a plea deal for 18 months on fraud charges, testifying against both Karen and Vinny, the scam's mastermind. Vinny's Maple Ridge Enforcement Solutions was dismantled after a multi-state investigation, revealing a network that had fleeced HOAs from Texas to Ohio. The FBI seized Vinny's assets, and he was sentenced to 7 years, his scam exposed as a predatory racket targeting power-hungry Karens, like Karen Maple Ridge's case, became a textbook example, cited in law enforcement seminars on HOA fraud and vigilante enforcement. The legal fallout reshaped Maple Ridge. The HOA, once Karen's weapon, was reborn under Sally's leadership. The new board, elected by a landslide, slashed the rule book to a single page. Be a good neighbor? Core-naive fiends were banned, replaced by voluntary cleanup days and community projects. Mrs. Thompson's knitting circle started a charity, donating scarves to shelters. Mr. Garcia opened a free repair clinic, fixing bikes and lawnmowers for kids. Bob the plumber spearheaded a community garden with Earl's peppers as the star crop. The neighborhood didn't just recover, it thrived, its unity a middle finger to Karen's legacy. Earl, true to form, stayed out of the spotlight. He declined a Citizen of the Year award from the town council, saying, "Give it to the kids. They're the ones who painted that birdhouse." But Maple Ridge wouldn't let him fade. At the second birdhouse day, Sally unveiled a plaque under Earl's oak tree. Sheriff Earl's stand, in honor of courage and community. Earl grumbled about the fuss, but his eyes glistened as Tommy read the inscription aloud. "You're stuck with us, Earl," Mrs. Thompson teased, handing him a slice of her famous pecan pie. Tom, Earl's lawyer friend, kept tabs on the legal ripples. The class action lawsuit against Karen forced her to liquidate her assets, repaying every resident she'd find. Maple Ridge used the funds to build a playground named Birdhouse Park. In a cheeky nod to the rebellion, Tom also pushed for state laws tightening HOA oversight, citing Maple Ridge as a warning. Karen wasn't just a bully, he told a legislative panel. She was a symptom of a system that lets petty tyrants run wild. His bill passed, dubbed the Maple Ridge Act, ensuring no HOA could wield unchecked power again. As summer rolled into Maple Ridge, the neighborhood felt alive. Kids raced bikes through cul-de-sacs, parents waved over picket fences, and Earl's birdhouse buzzed with sparrows. The standoff, the gun, the trial, they were history, but they'd left a mark. Maple Ridge had learned that freedom isn't free, that community takes work, and that one man's stand can change everything. Earl, sipping coffee on his porch, watched a new family move into Karen's old McMansion, their kids already eyeing his birdhouse. He smiled, knowing Maple Ridge was in good hands. The law had spoken, the tyrant had fallen, and the birds kept singing. And there you have it, folks. The unbelievable, heart-pounding saga of Karen's fake HOA cops and Maple Ridge's fight for justice. From a birdhouse to a courtroom, this story had it all. Guns, scams, and a sheriff who wouldn't back down. If you're as fired up as I am, smash that like button to show some love. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more. HIOA Karen Files. We've got plenty of tyrants to expose. Drop a comment. Ever dealt with a Karen who crossed the line like this? Or got your own HOA nightmare? Spill it. We're all ears. Check out our playlist for more epic showdowns, linked in the description. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. See you next time for another dose of suburban justice. Stay tough, stay united, and keep those birdhouses flying.